Hey, I wanted to give a special introduction to today's conversation and take an opportunity to just restate what the Soloist podcast is about. So, singleness is a tricky topic to talk about well, and it's awkward too. There's a classic split in how people tend to react to it, with half the room thinking that we would all be better off if we just worked through our hangups and got married, while others think it's the culture that needs to change and drop expectations that everybody's family or relationship situation should look just one way. And we're not taking either side here. We're not assuming that everyone would be better off married, and we're also not telling everyone that it's all going to be okay and that there's not real cost to the single life. Instead, we're trying to slow down and just walk carefully through the articulating what it's like and honestly exploring the questions that it raises for our lives. What's scaring us about it? How does it shape how we find meaning in life, how we're connecting with other people, and what the future looks like? Ultimately, I agree with something I hear a lot, which is that it's best not to think too much about these things. It's like the famous line that love will come when you least suspect it. And I think that's true whether we're talking about love from a specific kind of romance or just a kind of peace and ease in our own skin and in our lives. But for better or for worse, it is easy to fixate on this question and to feel alone in an area of life that looks so easy to other people. We want our conversations here to offer just the right touch of attention on the issue, to be able to see and articulate what troubles us, and to re-enter life with more peace and confidence and better stories to be able to face them. We also hope it'll be helpful to church leaders or to anyone else wanting to think through how to care for a community with people of varying family situations forward. So today, Mallory and I are talking to our brilliant friend, Kristine Haglund, and we don't talk about it in this episode, which is why I wanted to bring it up here. Kristine wrote an essay called Single in the Borderlands several years ago that we highly recommend. And in this episode, we're talking about the way that social media fixation on what a family should look like, and in particular Mormon families, can produce feelings of envy and also just confuse the purpose of family. And Kristine said something in Single in the Borderlands that I think really related to this. She points out that a great deal of theologizing about families is too tidy to be useful. The theology may be pretty, but in a way that a ballroom chandelier is pretty. It requires a complicated apparatus and a whole lot of luck to light it up and to bask in its splendor. Later on in the essay, when talking about our temptation to blame ourselves if we can't summon and produce this brilliant chandelier in our own lives, she writes that we need to clean from every corner of your psyche the cobwebs of not enough, of broken, cursed, unworthy, defective, and incomplete. Evict the ugly shards of brittle stories about what should be. Do the work it takes to tell yourself a different story and then really believe it. And with that, we'll just make one more plug to check out Kristine's essay that we'll link to, and now we'll jump in.
Hey everybody, you're listening to The Soloists. I'm Mallory Everton, here with my friend Diana Brown. And today we are talking with Kristine Haglund. Kristine, we're so happy to have you here. Would you mind introducing yourself and a little bit of what you've been writing about and thinking about lately?
Sure. My name's Kristine Haglund. I think my claim to fame in the Latter-day Saint world is that I edited dialogue for several years. And so some people know me from that work or my blogging on By Common Consent. I'm a Gen Xer. I have 3 kids who range in age from 23 to 27. And I put off my career while they were little, and I stayed home with them. And so I am now quite belatedly in graduate school doing a PhD in American Studies.
Awesome. You were telling me this story when we were talking on the phone in preparation for this conversation about your son one time questioning why you would take your kids to such a family-focused church when your family didn't feel like the ideal, and even your son there was some kind of ideal family that was live enough in his imagination of what Mormonism was about. And he was like, why would you take us here, Mom? Anyway, do you want to talk about what he was getting at there?
Yeah, sure. So I was divorced when my kids were little, all in elementary school. And what was striking to me about this conversation with my son was that he said, why would you take us to a church that's about family? And it was that phrasing of it particularly that was striking to me, because I definitely did not think that I belonged to a church that is about family. I grew up thinking very much that my church was about Jesus and about Zion and about my family's heritage, maybe, and family in a big, broad sense. But the nuclear family emphasis intensified so much over the last decades of the 20th century and through the early decades of the 21st that my children had a completely different experience of what Mormonism is fundamentally than I did.
Can you say more about that? What do you think changed and why was it so different? And why did you keep taking your son to church?
Well, let me answer the second question first. I think because it didn't occur to me not to. My own sense of myself is so thoroughly tied up with belonging to the church, and my sense of my family also has to do with that. My father's family is generations in the church, and my mother was a convert, and that was very much at the core of who we thought we were. So it didn't cross my mind to stop going. And the reasons for the intense emphasis on family, I think maybe the easiest, readiest explanation is the politics of the 1970s and its reaction to anxieties about feminism and about women working, and a felt loss of respect for authority and tradition in the 60s and 70s in the United States. It was also a successful missionary approach for the church for a while. In the 70s and 80s, they did these home front ads that were super popular about families with like cute little anecdotes of family life. And I remember that when I was growing up, whenever we had a baptism, they would show those home front commercials in the time while the person was getting dressed again after they were baptized. And those were wildly popular. And so I think it was appealing both as a response to the national situation and to the church's growth, right? It was also a unifying feature that could help the church relate to the world into which it was spreading, right? The church's membership outside of the U.S. starts growing really in the 60s. So it's all happening at the same time. And we're trying to figure out, well, what do church members in Utah have in common with church members in Tokyo or other places? And family, I think, was an obvious place to look for commonalities and connection.
Wow. Yeah, that's very thorough and makes a lot of sense. Obviously family's always been here in the room, more than in the room, but like the particular emphasis and priority that you give it and how it shapes the way people are connecting to each other. And it's almost hard for me to imagine what an alternative would be. I'm curious what it was like before this.
Yeah. And it's not that it wasn't there. I certainly had my fair share of young women's lessons on the joys of motherhood and stuff like that. And people talked about their families. But there was a lot more emphasis, I think, on the culture of the ward family. So besides my primary teachers and my Sunday school teachers, I had young women's leaders and Sunday school teachers all through growing up. Plus, I had the roadshow coach and the volleyball coach and the basketball coach and the dance competition coach, who were all invested in me as a kid and in the ward family. And those were all spaces where people could come and connect and have experiences that weren't even directly focused on church necessarily, but grew out of membership in the church, where people were included and welcomed and valued in various roles that might or might not have anything to do with their family status.
Yeah, that's it.
It does seem like a bit of a shame to get away from that, not just because there are so many people who don't fit into nuclear families in a sort of classically impressive or presentational way, but because that is clearly what Mormonism, one of like the main tenets of Mormonism, is binding us all together and sealing us all together and consecrating the whole project. I really do think that my wires got really crossed a lot into thinking that essentially family was heaven, and heaven on earth only existed for people who had families to an extent.
Yeah, I like my family, but I think that families are supposed to give us practice at relationships, at conflict and resolving it, or living with it. They're to teach us about reining in our own desires and needs for the sake of a greater good. And if that stops at the door of our home, then
Yeah.
what are we doing it for, right? I think that if being in a Mormon family doesn't prepare us to show God's love in bigger ways in the world, then we've missed it. We've
Yeah.
stuck to worshiping the next closest thing to worshiping ourselves, right?
Ourselves.
Is worshiping our family.
Oh, Christine, I love that so much. I love the idea that our families are a training ground so that we can go out and treat people the way we treat our families, ideally. The cool thing, too, about your family is that you don't pick them the way you don't pick anyone or anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We have very scant control in our lives, really. And so, like, the one thing we can decide to do is treat everybody like family. So I just think that's great. Appreciate that.
I think, yeah, as I was thinking about this, it's hard to be like, okay, is there too much emphasis on the family? Should we return? And what would the alternative be? And I just keep thinking the evidence for me is that however awkward it is to talk about singleness, it feels so necessary. And like people do feel alienated and like there's something really off about their belonging if they don't find themselves in a nuclear family situation in adulthood. And there's a culture that doesn't know how to hold those people.
Oh, I was just going to say, and that's a really weird thing for a Christian church, right? A church nominally grounded in the teachings of Jesus. We don't know anything about Jesus's family. His encounters with other people never situate them, or not never, but only really occasionally situate them in families, right? We know Jairus comes on behalf of his daughter, and sometimes we know that they're sibling like Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But for the most part, Jesus encounters people as individuals.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and so it's odd, right, that we've constructed a Christian church in which we find it difficult to encounter people simply as individuals.
One thing that my dad has said my whole life, whenever something happens, he and my mom got in a fight or my brothers got in a fight or whatever's happening, he's always like, we are just not the family on the cover of the Ensign. And like the family on the cover of the Ensign has just been like part of our family as like, that's not us. And it's just so interesting to think. And I doubt we're the only family that thinks that way. Right. And like just so aware of the gap between this image and what family life actually feels like, which is much closer to what you were describing, which is this like constant friction where you're learning to not be a narcissist. And like learning to think about others and to really figure out like what life is about. But it certainly is not about obtaining this beautiful image, right? I certainly have a testimony of family and I'm so deeply grateful for my family. So this is far from wanting to come across as like ungrateful or diminishing the sacredness of it. But it is like the sacredness comes not from what it looks like, not obtaining this beautiful color coordinated family picture. It's those moments when you're able to be beside another human soul and accompanying them in their journey, and the way that siblings and parents can do that so intimately for each other. And anyway, it's just to say that I think there's something about the image of the family, and particularly like the Mormon family, that feels like the problem here. And thinking of family as an image. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah. One of my favorite cards that I've ever seen in my life had on the front of it a picture of a woman standing in a field of like wildflowers and kind of looking off into the distance and smiling. And when you opened it up, it said, "On your birthday, wishing you the kind of happiness normally reserved for deodorant commercials." I think about that a lot.
Yeah. In general, like TV and television and magazines and like having such an image saturated, image mediated world produces all sorts of these things. And family is only one of them that makes us think we're supposed to be having a life that looks a particular way. And yeah.
I wonder if that's related to the changes in the church. I mean, I grew up in a very weird family with no TV most of the time. So I was an extreme example, but I think in general in the 70s and even into the 80s and 90s, the world was a lot more text-based. images weren't coming at us as fast. So a lot of my imagination about families or anything else came from translating text in my head to my own imagery of it, making a movie in my head. And when I ask them, like, when you read a book, do you see a movie in your head? And they're like, "Mm, mm, no, not really." I mean, it's a skill that they have less because they've needed it less, right? That somebody already made that movie, or they
Mm.
could just pull out their
Wow.
phone and make the movie themselves. And so I wonder if that image internal image generation capacity
Yeah.
is weakened, and that's part of why our imagination about family is flattened a little bit.
I think that's such
Mhm.
a good way of putting it, like a flattened imagination. And you mentioned too, just the idea of becoming an image, which just makes me think immediately. It does feel like we can't get away from talking about prosperity gospel here, because it feels like whether it's, worshiping the beauty ideal or the perfect romantic relationship or the perfect family, these are all things that are actually about prosperity gospel and not really about life or about people. And with social media, I was reading, I think it was the Deseret article that you sent about the various like TikTok stars and different bloggers and people who had developed a following and were also talking about the gospel alongside that, like, and getting asked questions like the classic question of like, why are you and your family so happy? Like, where's the light in your eyes coming from? I like grew up hearing stories like that and being like, that's how I want to be. So perfect that and so happy that people need to come up and ask me what my secret is. And I'm not sure if you can get away from it. If you're putting it online and intentionally, then you aren't really showing us a three-dimensional life. You're showing us an angle of a life that looks attractive in a certain way. And I don't know. To me, I just start thinking about prosperity gospel and missionary work and like these big tenets of how do we make our church look appealing to people and how do we make sure that we're giving them the goods. And that feels really different than being able to show up as a person whose family just fell apart on Sunday all by yourself or whatever. Like nobody puts that on social media, and sometimes people don't go to church with that either. It just feels like there's so much about presentation here. It feels like a very pertinent question because the image of the Mormon family seems to be so popular. Like we have all of these really big, I'm going to forget some of them, but we have like the various like the Mormon mommy wars and the design mom, like the mommy bloggers phase. And now we have all these like, we have secret lives of Mormon wives and all these like TikTok dance moms that came out of the Mormon community and have a bunch of kids and stuff like that.
Kristine, you spent so long thinking about the representation of Mormon families in this space. Like, I remember watching a video that you did at some conference a long time ago about Mormon mommy bloggers, which seemed like a precursor to like today's influencers. And you had a lot of insights about like, what is this? Like, why are we representing family this way?
Yeah, so mommy blogging and the Mormon bloggernacle, which we called it back in the day, started in like the early aught, parallel to each other, although obviously the mommy blogs were wildly more popular. But so I was in the boys' clubhouse really, where they wrote about doctrine and argued about at the time, it was like 2004, 2005. We argued a lot about marriage equality and how the church was approaching it. So we were engaging with ideas of family in that way, but it was very text based, posts and
Mhm.
comments, and not very many images. And partly, I guess I got interested in mommy blogs in the way that when I was in high school, I was a kind of ugly girl making fun of cheerleaders to make myself, I started paying attention to mommy blogs and thinking about how much I didn't want to do that. Um, but that may not have been actually my motivation. And I was curious, partly because there's always been this tension, right? Especially for Mormon women who are bright and ambitious, and maybe if they weren't Mormon, wouldn't think twice about having a high-powered career, right? And so what do they do? And so a lot of them started to blog, and some of them made money at it. in some cases a fair amount of money. And so I was curious about, what it means to technically obey the injunction or the perceived injunction for women to stay at home with their children and also make money from doing it. Like they're really complicated questions about what does that mean if you're posting pictures of your child or of your pretty fancy home and you're generating income from that. And so what's the problem with going to work in other ways?
Wow.
So those were the questions I was interested in. And again, it was partly personal. I had put aside an academic career after my first child was born because I didn't think I could do tenure and toddlers at the same time. I'm just not smart enough to do that. And yeah, so I was just curious about those kinds of questions and the ways that we tell women that their highest purpose is to be mothers in the home. And yet the whole church runs on the unpaid labor of women with young children. Every ward in the church collapses if the women say, nope, my job is primary and it's to be at home. Like we
Yeah.
couldn't do it. And we're fine with a primary president who uses all her artistic talent to make brilliant primary lessons. But we're not fine with someone who goes to work as a marketer to use all those exact same talent. Those were the kinds of questions I was thinking about in the early aughts. And then it started the genre of, I'm obsessed with Mormon mommy blogs. Why are all the mommy blogs Mormon? That article that now gets written every 18 months or so in some publication or another started in like 2007, maybe. So then I wasn't alone in my thinking or even particularly original.
Do you have an answer to that question? Like, why are all the Mormon mommy bloggers Mormon?
It's partly what I was saying about like why they're all looking for work they can do at home with their children. I remember Gabby Blair, who did the blog Design Mom. She was the first and I think probably the most successful of the mommy bloggers, although she wasn't focused specific. It was a little different, right? Because she was focused on design and houses more than family and some in the ways that some others were. But she talked about the 13th article of faith and how looking for the positive and the good and the beautiful in even ordinary life is inculcated into people in our church as that, like, you're supposed to be looking all the time for if there's anything lovely, right? We're supposed to be seeking it out. And so I think there's also the fact that women are ambitious and competitive, even when we would prefer not to believe that, when we would like to think that they are nurturing and cooperative and all of those wonderful gender essentialist things. And they like to compete. And this was an obvious place where some women were excelling and making money and fulfilling their ambition of various kinds. And I think we should be honest about that motivation too. Even though it is weird to ambitiously chronicle your nurturing, right? It's kind of contradictory.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, I have a fraught relationship with social media. Like that's the best way I feel like I could put it. And in part, it's because I was working on Studio C. It's like 10 years ago now, and at the time, kind of developed a following just because of that job, and then was trying to figure out what to do with it and whether or not there was anything useful that could come out of it, and if it could help the success of the show, that it was worth it. And so we were doing these collaborations with various different people, and I became much more aware of that world in general, like the world of influencers and the world of people who were either putting their skills or putting their lives online and then developing fans just for quote unquote being themselves. And I feel like the one fear I walked away with more than anything was like, do not make your personal life your source of income. Because some of the different, like rises and falls that I felt like I witnessed were just, well, and even in myself, the feeling of, oh, I'm on vacation, but what part of this can be captured? And what part of this can be
Yeah.
useful? And what part of this can be money? And like, and not that I was making money, but that's essentially what it is, like what part of my beautiful weekend with my family will be entertaining to everyone or like consumption for others. And um but the worst of it, I feel like, is the idea that if you have to present a happy family because that is literally your brand, um, and you are a business and you have a brand, um,
Yeah.
then you're not allowed to have a real family. They're not real.
Yeah.
And
It's
your
true.
kids are your employees and your husband is too. And it's
And kids
just,
are the worst employees.
I
Like,
can only imagine. I know that they're terrible
I
actors most of the time. So,
Yeah, I think that gets at something really key, Mallory. Well, I guess the key question that it gets at is, are these just families that happen to be documented, or is there something about the documentation of them that makes it, that is its own kind of problem? And it probably depends on the degree, right? Like all of us are documenting our lives to some degree, like all of us
Mhm.
are wrapped up in this culture. So it's a spectrum thing. It's not like a black or white. And going back a little bit, Kristine, I really related to what you were saying about the desire to make fun of cheerleaders.
Mhm.
I had that too. I was always a nerdy, awkward girl, like not very comfortable with my body, and more like was into orchestra, didn't get sports at all, did not know what to do with my body at a school dance or at a sports game, like for the life of me, and was so jealous of people who could, who just like had an ease with their bodies that way. And with dating and with seduction and making a move, which is partly why like I've always been bothered by, you know, the thinking about my BYU Relief Society president when I was like a freshman at Heritage Halls, and she got married as a freshman. And I just remember like everyone being like, she's so amazing. And also she's like made out with all these guys, and just like seeing that it worked for her and that she got to like win the Mormon story by being this like seductress. And like, I just had such conscientiousness. I couldn't do that. I didn't know how to be with, like, just for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to do that. It took me a long time to just be more comfortable with my body that way, with sexuality, to be honest. And I had intense envy of people who could do that. But it's not as simple as envy, right? Because it was also a value difference. There was also a part of me that was like, I feel called to spend my time on thornier issues. I then like getting Brett down the hall to like me. Like I just didn't feel like those were things that called to me. Like even like thinking about my own family, I feel like the problems in my family like motivated so much of my intellectual and spiritual searching. And there's always been a part of me that has wanted to just be better than the cheerleader.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's fair. But certainly there's room here for like Paul's, spiritual gifts, and that we all have things to bring. But there just didn't seem like there was this competition between the girls who just could like exist in this material world and that they could win that way. And it just bothered me so much that the church would like congratulate them for winning, right? Like getting married young and figuring out how to do this thing. And I just felt complicated.
I have an essay that I don't know how to write, but really want to, about being the ugly girl in the chastity lesson.
Hmm.
Like,
Oh,
what
Yeah.
that was like. It's just, yeah.
What would you say about it?
I don't know. And I was definitely not like you're clearly a deeper person than I was, because I was just mad that I couldn't be that girl. Like I did not feel called to more complicated things. It just, if I could have, I would have gone to BYU and been a cheerleader. Like if that had been in the realm of possibility for me, I think that's what I would have wanted.
I hear you there. I just feel like I had a dark enough childhood that like I grew up feeling like Wednesday Addams. And so like I've just been making fun of these women my whole life. Like I literally did it for my job. I felt called out when you pointed out being the girl making fun of the cheerleaders because I know that's what I'm doing.
I
In
know.
part because I can't be them and I wish I could because it looks easy, even though I know it's not,
Yeah.
you know?
I'm curious too. I relate to that too. Also, Mallory, can we please have that on the record? Like, I think that's what I was
Sure.
trying to say too. I also felt like just I had a darkness
Mhm.
that I had to work with. And Christine, I also just like wanting to follow up on that. The chastity lesson. So are you saying that there was this awkward thing going on where like technically you're talking about the lines nobody should cross, but then also it's like if you were in a situation where you might get to cross the line, that's
Or
exciting. And I don't know what's the
or
chastity
like,
lesson part of it.
I mean, even just that I couldn't achieve the virtuous thing that they wanted me to. I couldn't virtuously renounce sex because it was not a remote possibility.
Wasn't
for
an
me.
option.
Like I couldn't. No
Yeah.
boys would
Yeah.
come within 100 yards of me. So like, how was I going to virtuously stop kissing them? Like, I
Yeah.
couldn't do it.
I remember
that.
this girl in my seminary class. She was like a senior. I was a sophomore. Her being like, I had a guy over the other night and I thought to myself, we are not going to be horizontal. That's when bad things happen. And she got the opportunity to virtuously reject this, but just that kind of thing, right?
I don't know that you can get away from talking about the church's, I don't even want to call it, but our church community's odd relationship to the beauty ideal for women, like the plastic surgery stuff and the sort of like the beauty standards, even just like in the densely Mormon populated place of Utah. Like this feels a lot like it's about beauty and being desired and being able to tout that as almost like a virtue signal. Like this means I'm a good person. This means God loves me because I'm beautiful. So it's easy for me to get married and not weird. Like
Yeah.
I'm just like, I've been
Well,
too weird to get married my whole life, I guess.
Same
well,
here.
and at least part of it comes out of the fact that is women's only access to power
Right.
within our church, right? You can
Yeah.
exercise
Yep.
power through your husband, maybe, or by getting a man, your bishop or your stake president, to go along with your plan, which is not always entirely about rational persuasion. I think sometimes, of course, women are competitive and women do this to themselves to some degree, but I think particularly within the church, we should be careful not to blame um, people who are caught up in a system that they can't adequately
Yeah.
resist.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Like I'm thinking of a particular, very recent. I went to the YSA ward because it meets later in the afternoon. So sometimes if I miss sacrament meeting in my own ward, I go to the YSA ward still. And there was a new high councilman or some visiting authority or something like that, and his wife was sitting in the back. He gets up on the stand and he's sharing whatever he needs to share, and he's like, and my wife back there, and she's wonderful, and yep. And he waits for everybody to turn and look at her and is like, I married up, right? And they're like in their 50s or 60s, but like this, I have grown up with this my entire life. It's like you can tell from how beautiful my wife is. And the fact that I still think she's beautiful, even though now we're quote unquote old, is even cuter, right? I've never really known what to do with that because it just never felt like that was the kind of woman I was or the kind of thing or creature that I
Yeah.
was. Like I can put on a dress, but you cannot stop me from making like a crass joke in it. And I can't. I've always been that way.
Yeah.
I'm very aware, like just on my like own from my own many anecdotal examples, that this is just alive and well in the way that we talk about what makes a woman a catch. What makes a woman a I can't ever get away from that. I have to rethink it in therapy all the time that I'm not some kind of prize. I'm not a prize.
Yeah.
I don't need to be the best prize. I'm allowed to be myself, but because I've spent my whole life being like, well, I can't be that. I'm nobody's angel mother, and I'm also not a beauty queen, which is the other way I could get into being a catch.
Yeah. My husband is forbidden to mention me over the pulpit unless it's in a quotation from Spencer's Fairy Queen. It means he never mentions me over the pulpit, and I like it that way.
Oh, it feels like it relates to what we're talking about with the idea of presenting your happy family life on social media. I've always felt the same way about the pulpit, that there's an attitude, especially if it feels like, oh, I say I love my wife and I say all these great things in front of people, but not necessarily to her. I don't know. There's just something about presentation that just means the egomania is alive and well.
I've been curious to thinking about this problem of envy and how live that is here and what we're supposed to do about it. And particularly the way that manifests for women. Kristine, you sent us this article from Mary Harrington that I really enjoyed, where she was like going through different theories for Ballerina Farm's account. Now, Ballerina Farm is our most famous, the like Mormon influencer today, I think. And like 10 million followers, and everybody's constantly writing about her. And she goes through these theories of like, is this really like, what is this really? Is she really oppressed? I don't know. She's this extremely successful businesswoman who's also like very hot and seems well adjusted and happy in her life. But then there's this evidence that her husband maybe pressured her into certain things and didn't let her take pain medication or, things like that. And then she had this line, and perhaps this gives us a clue as to what's really driving Ballerina Farm discourse: envy. For a 21st century productive household of this kind is not available to all. More than ever, the internet has made it possible for mothers to have it all after a fashion. The rewarding, economically active life, the big family, the beautiful home, all woven together with the remote working possibilities opened up by the internet. But not all women, just those with the skills, the money, the charisma, the space for the home office, and a spouse who shares their vision. And I don't know, that's where I've come down on this thing too, which is why I appreciated like us starting with the cheerleader thing, is like how, I mean, I don't know, just envy. What are we supposed to do about that?
Can I make it more complicated?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
please.
I think we could here link envy with nostalgia, which also drives a lot of this imagery, right? It, trad wives has traditional in the name of it, and in fact, of course, it isn't traditional. This
Yeah.
past never existed, and so there's something about this longing for a false thing can never be satisfied. So it is an endless source of marketing possibility, right? Because if people are going to continue to feel this yearning for a thing that doesn't exist, right, they're going to keep wanting it because it can't be satisfied. And
Yeah.
I think that's a way that this nostalgia and this wish for the angel mother that none of us ever had
Yeah.
links up with capitalism in
Yeah.
staggeringly unhealthy ways.
Like we have a human impulse for envy already to look around us and compare. But then there's something about images and marketing. And this is precisely what she's doing, is marketing. That is also the whole point of it, is to feed want, and it's going to be bottomless, and tying it with nostalgia that like taps into all of our insecurities about modern life. And like, geez, what are we doing? And why is it this hard after we've climbed this far as a society? And it's just tickling some like deep fear we all have that we're on the wrong track, and she's figured it out.
Yeah. And a lot of the family stuff in Mormonism is tangled up in wanting to be accepted as Americans, right? In that period post polygamy, but also all of America in that period, 1880s, 1890s, is trying to figure out what America is, what the nation is. And the nation always gets figured as a woman, right? So there's this spasm of creating monuments to pioneer women in the 1890s. And then it happens again in the 20s when women are starting to be more liberated. It's a sort of anti-flapper movement, is to build more statues of pioneer women in long dresses and bonnets, because they're the ideal woman, the ideal American woman rather than the flapper. And it's the Depression, so it's economic anxiety. And the fact that right now, trad wives and ballerina farm are popular has everything to do with these anxieties. I also think Mormons are still trying to figure out how we are Americans, right? Mitt Romney didn't win the presidency, and maybe all of this would be different if he had. And we don't really know how much, evangelicals with whom so many Mormons vote and make common political cause, they still don't really think we're Christians. So that
Hmm.
there are just a lot of things that aren't about gender roles
A
that
lot of
we
layers.
that we litigate on the territory of gender roles because, somehow that is a well-worn mental track that we know how to go down.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting. This desire for respectability in people's eyes. And I remember reading something a long time ago, and I don't remember like what exactly this was, but um, about polygamy era Utah and how Mormon women over-indexed on the domestic arts and fashion and these things that could make them appear respectable. That was their one pathway too, which again, to your point, it's not just that, this is what women do. They like clothes. It's like that was an avenue for Mormon women to obtain respectability in the eyes of the world while maintaining to their religious commitments in their families that were formed by the religious family structures. And I think there's still that too. Like Mormon women aren't known today for being bright intellectuals, even though there's many among us, including Kristine here. They're known for mommy blogging and for being like incredible at the domestic arts and incredible, beautiful homemakers and beauty itself. I saw some tweet the other day that was like, I don't feel insecure about my looks at the LA or New York airport, but I do in the Salt Lake City airport. It was like somebody who doesn't live here, but that's the legacy that we've made somehow.
And I want to just like make a little bit of a plug for allowing that to be the case. I think one of the brilliant things about Mormonism is that it is a religion of practice. And so we don't believe that you only need to like go into your house and meditate until you generate kindness within yourself. We assign people to be kind to two or three particular people in their ward on a regular basis. And we hope
Yeah.
that practicing that kind of kindness will eventually inculcate real love in our heart, right? And we practice disciplining ourselves to drink our caffeine cold instead of hot in hopes that maybe someday we gain enough self-control to just not be addicted to substances at all.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is. Like I am not opposed to the external and physical and even seemingly trivial practice of religion. Like I think there is something beautiful about that.
I appreciate your point, and I totally agree. Like I don't think we should be like, it's bad to be beautiful. It's bad to enjoy dressing up and baking sourdough. Like the point isn't to say that. Um, but I do wonder about a life lived to get attention. We all know like all of us want attention, all of us want admiration, but we all know at some point we want to rise above that. And that's what like religion and to return it to family should be like pointing us to, is like the joy that comes from actually being among others. And that's something, what it means to be godlike, I suppose, to do that. I guess what makes me uncomfortable with it is the lifestyle where it depends on you constantly flaunting your curated, beautiful image before others' eyes. Just, I suppose maybe you could do that in a way that like invites others in, but it feels like inherently it just invites people to like feel alienated and feel bad about themselves. Yeah.
I think the key in there is that you said alienation. And Mallory, you talked about this too when you were like, what part of my, beautiful vacation with my family can I advertise? And that fundamental alienation from yourself means that you can never not be alienated from other people too, right? Like it's inevitable. And so part of the problem is that a lifestyle focused on attention means you can perform happiness, but you probably have a very hard time really feeling joy, right?
Yeah.
Really experiencing that deeper joy. I mean, maybe sometimes when the camera's off, but you can't perform joy in front of a camera, right?
I'm finding this conversation really helpful, in part because I came in like ready to hold myself back from just railing on it. I mean, honestly, just like, I'm not going to go there, but here's what I really think. You know what I mean? If they're coming from uh, limited sources of power for women and a deep desire for nostalgia that is actually just human longing for something that we never had.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, in the same way that we can be seduced by ideal images of what it means to be a Mormon or a Mormon wife or a Mormon mother or whatever, the world, unfortunately, is also very seduced by images of Mormonism. And I think what we crave is to just not be an image and to not be like two missionaries knocking on your door or a woman in a harem or a hot woman with a boob job and impressive lip filler or whatever, but to just be people who you want to bring to the table for dialogue because they're smart, thoughtful, ecumenical people, even if they're, have some zany beliefs or whatever. Like, we're glad when there's women that give like a different image or a positive image, but wouldn't it be great to just not be an image as a people?
Yeah, that feels really present for me. I don't think we can get away from the fact that some of what we're discussing is a reaction to that, that in it,
Yeah.
like you were both saying, like in an effort to try and access more belonging, whether it be on like the American front or the just social media, how can I belong and be cool and respected and popular like other people?
Yeah.
That's some of why we're getting some of this stuff. It's like, well, what am I good at? What do people care about? What do lots of people need to do? And it's like Mormon women making the most of what will gain them access to life. And it's in part, I don't think you can get away from the fact that it's in part because Mormons are essentially still extremely misunderstood. And if you look at the list of public opinion of religions, we're like 26th on a list of 30, And like I want to say we're right under Wiccans as far as like being understood. Like that was the and it was right above Christian Scientists and Scientologists on the list, So more power to these women trying to just like access a feeling of belonging. I understand it because I'm a person too, and I feel I've tried to do the same thing my whole life by just getting people to laugh at my jokes before I sprung on them that I was actually a Mormon later in the conversation.
What's the line from the Johnny Cash biopic, Reese Witherspoon? We're all just trying to matter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. That is good. What do you guys think we should do about envy? There are always going to be people who are hotter than you, who have lives that like just seem easier. I think about Hannah Millivan from Ballerina Farm, and I just think like, yeah, there are always these things that could potentially bother me, but when I get down to it, I'm like, I really do think at root in my issue is something like jealousy. The thing that I envy about her is that her life looks really hard. I have not been able to choose things that are that hard in my life, but she also seems like fine with it. And I just think about how much I envy well-adjusted people who can encounter troubles in life and not overthink them and just sail through them. Like, yeah, just have 8 babies and know how to be with the husband. And she's not like overtaken with irritation at him or disappointment at whatever it is that overtakes me and just seems to complicate everything that prevents me from sailing through life with ease like that. I know that's what I deeply envy about her. And anyway, I'm just like wondering what really is the answer to that.
I'm going to recommend getting old,
Mm-hmm.
turning 50. I mean, not all of that disappears, obviously, but it does. And eventually, I think some of it does. I think getting old enough that not every life trajectory seems possible anymore. Like some of the options are
Yeah.
foreclosed to me now.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And when I was 25, I probably still could have chosen
Yeah.
a lot of different things. And that gave the envy a kind of fuel and anxiety that it just doesn't have anymore. I can look at her and think, yeah, I really wish I had looked like that 12 days after I had a baby, but it doesn't have the same sting because there's no possibility that I'm going to go back in time and, do 47 sit-ups a day or whatever it takes to look like that 12 days after you have a baby. Or most often these days, envious of people who actually finished their PhDs at an appropriate time in life. But that also comes with less of a sting because I had, 15, 18 years with some pretty remarkable humans who are my children, and I like them, and I'm glad that I had that, even though I did really grieve that academic career. That is real grief, but you get better at grieving as you get old because you lose more things.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound cheerful, but actually it kind of is.
Accepting that life can only be one thing is, that does feel like the essence of getting older. Thanks for sharing that.
It's beautiful. I have so many thoughts about this. One of them is that I just think we should have such a healthy skepticism about the images that are presented to us. And that's not to say like, oh, I bet she's miserable. I bet Ballerina Farm's miserable. Or it's not that. It's just that it's like a crush, like at the beginning, the reason that crushes are so fun is because they're 2% a person and 98% all of your hopes and dreams and fantasies, And so it's actually, like the way we respond to these images actually has a lot more to, and maybe even looking at our envy as an opportunity. Like, what is it about my life that I would like to change? That I can actually do something about. I don't need to crap on myself and say I'm not doing as well as this person and play that comparison game. But I feel envy when I look at this person. And what is it? I just would inspect it, I'm trying to do that more with my own envy. Like, I've found myself being very envious of some people who are very brave in their careers. And so lately I've been trying to be braver, I can do that. I can't be that person, or I can't have that body. I can't have that body of work or anything, but I can inspect my envy and find out what it is that I might be able to change about my life to move forward. But I think maybe one of the most difficult things is that often we'll probably get to the idea that we feel that person's more loved than we are. And ultimately, I have a roommate that said this to me a couple months ago as she was working through like a body image insecurity thing. She was saying, beautiful people are not more loved. And I would not call popularity love. I think it's something else. I think it's more like fascination. I think it has more to do with people feeling inadequate on their own. I think like lots of eyes on you, lots of attention, that's very different than love. And beautiful people are not more loved.
Well, and this comes back to family, right? Because I think that's the lesson that we can learn deeply from having siblings, right? I at least have a sister who I think is sort of the glorified and perfected version of myself. But I know that my parents love both of us, right? And I think the best thing about intentional families, like that's maybe one of the best things that Mormonism has to offer about family is that intentionality. And if we can deeply learn the lessons that are available in a family, in a loving family, that prepares us to deal with our envy and anger and, all of the other things that we deal with in the rest of the world.
Yeah. When not only receiving that, but figuring out how to give it. There was a while last summer before some things in my personal life just crashed where I remember like kind of reaching this place. I was like, got a lot of things figured out. This is good. I've got this great job. Like I'm excited about it. And it was just one of those days, a lot of good things that seemed to happen all at once. So I was like, wow, like I can really release anxieties that I've had for a long time. And things eventually crashed and got really complicated with those precise things that I was happy about. But I remember going on a walk and being like, what's next? Which sounds so funny. But I remember just being like, I guess I just want to like figure out how to like love people. Like seriously, I was like, I don't need anything. I don't know. It was just so funny realizing how distracted I've been with thinking like, oh, I need to have, I mean, right now, I just feel like constantly insecure, like I don't have a resting ground. And I think that this is what's going to get me to cry. I think that's what I envy too about someone like ballerina farmers. Like my friends that just feel like they've got a place to land and they don't have to just constantly be building their shelter overhead by themselves. But I guess what was nice about that moment was just an opportunity to be like, okay, but this is the question that if I could feel settled and secure, this is the question of my life that I would want to focus on is like, how do I really be with people? How do I see them? And how do I not bring my anxieties and insecurities to a situation such that they're like this veil over my eyes so that I can't really just be with people as they are? Anyway, I think that's what I want to figure out. And whenever I can feel settled enough in my heart that I can see that that is the question that I have for myself, it's nice because it's a lot easier to figure out that question sometimes than figuring out the security stuff. And often it's just like getting over myself. And, that to me is what's scary about social media is how much it makes us think about ourselves and us losing a capacity to just be together in a way that's irrespective of image and like who you're going to be tagging in your pictures and how many followers this person has and what it'll be look like to be. I don't know. They're just all of those things that are so distracting and scary. But um, anyway, just thinking about family is kind of nice because at least family pre the social media objectification of it is just constantly going to break down our images and of life. And that's where you really have to show up as a human being among other human beings. And it's like inescapable. And anyway, it gets us past modes of presenting.
I love you talking about the family as something that can be objectified, uh, because I think that feels like an important distinction, that what we're talking about is the difference between family in a way that makes us feel heartened and faithful and hopeful about the future versus an image of family that makes us feel far away from God. You brought this up in the article that you sent that you wrote, Kristine. You were quoting Peggy Orenstein when you said that girls shifted between subject and object day by day, moment by moment, sometimes without intending to, sometimes unsure themselves of which they were.
Mm.
And I like immediately wanted to cry because I was like, I feel this as a woman all the time, but I actually think this is happening with almost every good thing in life, kind of all the time. Like, is it something that we're using to turn toward life, or are we running from life by assuming that we've got this good thing and now we're good and now we're safe?
Yeah.
It feels very paradoxical and tricky, but I do think family is a portal to to turning toward our people who are not images in our life. They're the opposite. They're like the people who drive us nuts and the people that we were like born tied to. And then I loved your first definition of it, Kristine, the idea that our families are practicing grounds, that's where we're supposed to learn how to be people and essentially be like, yeah, we're all tied to each other. It's not just your brothers and sisters, your blood brothers and sisters. If you couldn't, and people have to decide what they're going to do with toxic relationships in their families. And I feel like that's an important discussion, but you're still bound forever and have to figure out how to properly love those people and from what distance or closeness. And I love the idea that is like an antidote of this constant, like, am I objectifying the most holy things in life and the most beautiful things in life or the people I love? Think about your family and what they can do for you, your family and your ward family, right? And plus you can't get you can get dopamine from social media, but you can't get oxytocin. I just heard that in a podcast a couple weeks ago. And I was like, turn to the people who can give you a long hug and maybe get off social media for a second. That's what I have to do.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
sad.
Well, maybe here this is a good place for my solitary spot of expertise on Eugene England, who I wrote a book
Ooh.
about a couple of years ago. And he has an essay that you probably know called Why the Church is as True as the Gospel. And towards the end of it, he takes this quote from a Catholic writer named Michael Novak. And he changes it to talk about how the church works in a similar way to the family to help people become better. Is it okay if I just read a slightly
please.
longish
Yeah.
paragraph?
Yeah,
Okay.
please. Yeah.
Family is an assault upon the lonely atomic ego. Family is a threat to the solitary individual. Family does impose grueling, humbling, baffling, and frustrating responsibilities. Yet if one supposes that precisely such things are the preconditions for all true liberation, family is not the enemy of moral development in adults, but the opposite. Being married and having children, or having siblings, or being active in the church, that's his parenthetical addition, has impressed upon my mind certain lessons for whose learning I cannot help being grateful. Most are lessons of difficulty and duress. Most of what I am forced to learn about myself is not pleasant. My dignity as a human being depends perhaps more on what sort of family member or church member I am than on any professional work I am called on to do. My bonds to my family and my church hold me back from many sorts of opportunities, and yet these do not feel like bonds. They are, I know, my liberation. They force me to be a different sort of human being in a way in which I want and need to be forced.
Amazing. So good.
Yeah, I just feel like it's very clear that one of our problems is that social media just cannot capture the many, many layers of like what makes your your family so beautiful is often the stuff you would never share.
Oh, yeah. And so unshareable.
Yeah.
Images are out of time. They're not real. And like that
Mm.
stuff is real, right? Like this being in time with other people and having these things exposed and new parts of yourself unlocked, Kristine.
I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Good stuff.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you want to continue the conversation with us, we've got a couple of options for you. You're welcome to email us with any feedback or topic suggestions at hello@thesoloists.org. You can also follow us on Instagram. Our account handle is the.soloists. And if you're not on Instagram, don't let us give you FOMO. Enjoy being unplugged from social media. Thanks, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.